I said that I was going to talk about OCD before, but I think in light of what's going on, I want to address general mental illness first. I've already addressed postpartum psychosis, and then I've addressed other mental illnesses, I guess, at some point. I know that I've mentioned that I have OCD, anxiety, depression, ADD, and I was just even thinking about a few things. For example, my sister was reading me an account where a woman who had some very serious issues was treated like crap, and to make a long story short, she had been horrendously raped and battered when she was a child, so she had problems that carried on into her adult life and even her elderly life, it seems like. And to make a long story short, for lack of a better term, the staff treated her like crap. And it's also a long story, by the way, and just one that, what's funny too is that Michelle, as she always does, unfortunately, tends to read this stuff, and sometimes it gets so long, and I'm like, okay, what's your point? And that only exacerbates what's going on a lot of the times. Anyway, it's not like I mean, that's what a lot of people do too, not just Michelle, but a lot of people will read or recall these, for lack of a better term, these stories or these events or whatever, and it's like, oh, you know, this happens every day, etc., etc. And many of us who have mental illnesses go, yeah, we know, we live through that every day. Yeah, we may not live that way in the sense that she lives, and we may not have that extreme of a circumstance. However, we know what it's like to be treated like crap. We know what it's like when no one's helping us. We know that we can't do everything, and we got our own burdens to bear, and now you're acting like, oh, well, this happens every day, you wouldn't know about this. You know, ask if those of us do know it, because we tend to deal with it, and again, maybe not as extreme as that woman had to deal with it, but plenty of us have been through the, for lack of a better term, shtick of being treated like pariahs and whatever else. And that's also part of why my sister and my mother and I are at odds with each other right now, because, to make a long story short, I tend to be a fan of Geraldo Rivera, and part of the reason for that is because he kept people like me out of Willowbrook. And Michelle and Mom get mad at me for, like, why are you even a fan of Geraldo? But I say to them, well, had it not been for people like Geraldo back in the 60s and 70s, I would have been in Willowbrook, because, okay, I already mentioned that I have OCD and depression, anxiety, ADD, and I also have cerebral palsy. And I had read the story about the man that Geraldo in particular had interviewed or worked with, and the young man had cerebral palsy. He was misdiagnosed as developmentally disabled, and he was in Willowbrook for a long time. And my mom and my sister say, well, that was back then, and we would have kept you out of Willowbrook. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you guys might have, but maybe Dad and some of his family wouldn't have. And then they would say, well, they couldn't do that. And they always get mad, and I bring up, and I brought up kind of admittedly snidely today to Michelle. I'm like, well, you know, you say that, but, well, I was kind of talking about, like, the way the mom always treats it, because to make a long story short, we had to continuously deal with our dad when we were going through some of the things that we were going through. And I mean, it was verbal abuse, emotional abuse, all that other stuff, which affected the onset of or exacerbated some of the conditions that I already have, and a majority of which I've inherited from him. And my mom always said, well, had I not sent you guys over there, I would have been in contempt of court. And that's what I'd snidely like to say to Mom too. Well, okay, if you didn't put me in somewhere like Willowbrook, and Dad tried to, and God didn't work it out, hey, if you tried to keep me out of Willowbrook, you would have been in contempt of court. So that's why I'm thankful that there were people like Geraldo Rivera back in the 60s and 70s. Still, though, just because those of us who have mental illnesses and then add the physical illnesses on our physical conditions, we're still treated like pariahs. We're still treated like the institutions were the best thing that they could have done for us. They've done worse to people before. I remember even reading, and this is another reason, unlike Martin Luther, I read a horror story about one time where a boy who was mentally disabled for whatever reason had been observed by Martin Luther, and Martin Luther said he had a demon in him and should be drowned. And just even as far back as the time of the so-called Reformation, and even it's just never really, in terms of people with disabilities, and even especially mental disabilities, but of course you have physical disabilities on that. You have this thing where it's just never really changed, and we still have a long way to go in terms of those who have disabilities, especially the mental disabilities. And I remember even a couple of days ago, I mentioned to a woman, because I was walking in my neighborhood and we were talking about memory problems, and she said, well, you're kind of young to be forgetting stuff. And I mentioned, well, I have ADD, and that's pretty much when the conversation ended. Of course, I didn't bring that up to my mother that whole incident happened, because she would have said, well, you shouldn't have brought it up anyway, or, oh, you shouldn't mention it, or, well, people don't always know how to deal with it. And, I mean, even just in everyday to-day examples, despite Willowbrook and, despite whatever else, we're still in that mentality of, for lack of a better term, the 1500s, and even worse in terms of how we treat people with mental and physical disabilities. In fact, in some ways, it's even worse. In some ways, what Martin Luther did to that young boy and what people in the institutions did to the patients, in some ways what they did is much tamer, at least on a physical level, tamer than what society does to people with mental illnesses and physical conditions today. And so, I mean, that's just one thing that I wanted to address, because that's kind of where I'm going in terms of, some of the mental illnesses I've had to deal with, and some of the conditions that I've had to deal with. And well, there's that, I guess. And so that's definitely one thing that I'm going to be talking about in the future, and one thing that I've been definitely thinking about. And well, there's that. And have a good evening or good day or whatever you have right now. I know that people are in different time zones and doing different things and all that. So there's that.